Lizzie Borden and the Bloody Axe. Mystery, the gruesome case that shook America 130 years ago. Dear friends, can you believe that a petite, unmarried young woman could be the one who brutally struck her own parents with an axe over 20 times? On a quiet morning in 1892, the entire nation was stunned when the bloodied bodies of Andrew and Abby Borden were discovered in their family home. And the only suspect was the youngest daughter of the household, Lizzie Borden. Nearly 130 years have passed, yet the mystery remains unsolved. If you're fascinated by chilling cases filled with suspense and deep psychological twists, don't forget to like this video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our true crime stories that continue to haunt history. A bloody morning in Fall River, a quiet town in Massachusetts, never imagined it would become the center of national attention for months on end in the year 1892. On the morning of August 4th, the house at 92 2nd Street suddenly turned into the scene of a grisly double murder. Two lives were taken in less than an hour. The weapon? An axe. The killer? Unknown. But all eyes quickly turned to one person, Lizzie Borden. At 32 years old, Lizzie was the youngest daughter in the household. She lived with her father, Andrew Borden, and her stepmother, Abby. Her older sister, Emma, was away at the time. The only other person present in the house that day was the maid, Bridget Sullivan, possibly the sole witness who could shed light on what really happened. Around 11 a.m., Lizzie let out a blood-curdling scream. Her father, Andrew, was found lying lifeless on the living room sofa, his head drenched in blood, his face so mutilated it was nearly unrecognizable. Moments later, as Bridget made her way upstairs, she discovered Abby's body lying face down in a pool of blood on the guest bedroom floor. The autopsy revealed that Abby had died roughly 90 minutes before her husband. She was attacked from behind, struck at least 17 times in the head with an axe. Andrew suffered around 10 blows, one of which was so forceful it fractured his skull. The chilling question remains: who could commit such a brutal act, and why? The backdrop of a troubled family. The Borden family lived in a modest two-story house on 2nd Street in Fall River, Massachusetts, a place that on the surface appeared peaceful, but behind closed doors, long-standing tensions simmered for years. Inside that house, the atmosphere was always strained, tight as a drawn bowstring. Andrew Borden, the patriarch, was one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the area. He owned numerous properties, held shares in textile mills, and served as president of the Union Savings Bank and the Durfee Trust Company. Despite his considerable wealth, Andrew was famously frugal, almost to a fault. Instead of moving his family to the more affluent part of town, he insisted on keeping them in their aging home in a middle-class neighborhood, with no electricity and no running hot water. Lizzie's biological mother, Sarah Borden, died when she was young. Andrew later remarried a woman named Abby Durfee Gray, who would become the focal point of growing conflict within the household. Although legally their stepmother, neither Lizzie nor her older sister Emma, ever referred to her as mother. They always called her Mrs. Borden, a deliberate sign of emotional distance. According to those who knew the family, the sisters firmly believed that Abby had only married their father for his money, and that she was manipulating him to secure the inheritance for herself, rather than his daughters. The household was cloaked in tension. Family meals, rather than moments of warmth, became silent battlegrounds where every word carried undertones of sarcasm and suspicion. Lizzie's relationship with Abby was especially strained. She once told a friend, "We live in the same house, but we are not part of the same family." Lizzie's relationship with her father also grew colder over time. While Andrew provided financial support, he showed little concern for his daughter's emotional well being or the mountain discord at home. His unwavering support for his new wife further alienated Lizzie and Emma. The final straw came when Andrew transferred ownership of several assets, including the home once belonging to Lizzie's late mother, into Abby's name. The sisters were furious. In retaliation, they secretly bought back their mother's former house for just $1, a bitter act of protest. Beneath the facade of affluence, the Borden family was fractured to its core. Within those brick walls, blood ties had eroded into distrust, resentment, and suppressed rage. And when such volatile emotions have nowhere to go, tragedy becomes only a matter of time. All it takes is a single spark to ignite an irreversible inferno. Lizzie, from victim to prime suspect. When police arrived at the crime scene on the morning of August 4th, 1992, Lizzie Borden, the 32-year-old youngest daughter of the family, was not immediately considered a suspect. On the contrary, she was seen as a poor, grieving woman who had just lost both her father and stepmother in a brutal and horrifying manner. As an unmarried woman, a Sunday school teacher, and an active volunteer in charitable work, Lizzie was widely regarded as the embodiment of Victorian virtue and respectability. However, as the investigation delved deeper into the details, that image began to unravel. What Lizzie said, and what she didn't, quickly drew the attention of investigators. The first red flag was her inconsistent statements. When asked where she was at the time of the murders, Lizzie gave several conflicting answers. Initially, she claimed to have been in the barn looking for some nails and metal to use as fishing sinkers. Hours later, she changed her story, saying she was in the kitchen. At another point, she said she'd been upstairs when she heard a noise. When asked why she didn't hear the sounds of the brutal attacks, despite both victims being struck multiple times with an axe, she calmly replied, "I didn't hear anything." Police grew even more suspicious after examining Lizzie's physical condition. Considering the savage nature of the murders, it was likely that the killer would have been covered in blood. Yet Lizzie was completely clean. No blood on her clothes, no smell, no signs of shock. This either meant she was innocent or extremely skilled at covering her tracks. Suspicion intensified a few days later when someone in the household reported that Lizzie had burned a dress in the kitchen stove. She explained that the dress was stained and had paint on it, but why burn it while the investigation was ongoing, especially when every item in the house could be considered evidence? Police suspected the stains weren't paint, but blood, and the burning of the dress was an attempt to destroy critical evidence. Adding to the intrigue, a small but significant detail surfaced. Just days before the murders, Lizzie had gone to a pharmacy and tried to purchase prussic acid, a deadly poison, claiming she needed it to clean a stain on her skin. The pharmacist refused the sale, finding her request suspicious. This incident only fueled the belief that Lizzie may have been planning something sinister all along. From being the grieving daughter in a family tragedy, Lizzie quickly became the focal point of a criminal investigation. Public sympathy turned into doubt. Investigators found no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no unusual footprints. On that morning, only Lizzie and the maid, Bridget Sullivan, were in the house, no one else. Though there was no direct evidence linking her to the crime, the contradictions in her statements, her unusual behavior, and the unexplained circumstances made Lizzie the prime suspect, and her name dominated newspaper headlines across America for months to come. Motives as conflicts and the question of inheritance. In any murder investigation, one of the most crucial questions detectives ask is, who had the strongest motive to kill? In the case of the Borden family, all signs seem to point toward Lizzie. not only because she was present at the scene, but also because of the underlying tensions and the enormous financial implications following the deaths of her father and stepmother. At the time of the murders, Andrew Borden, Lizzie's father, was one of the wealthiest men in Fall River. He owned multiple factories, numerous properties, and served as an executive at a prominent bank. Despite his wealth, he was notoriously frugal and extremely cautious with money. Most notably, he had never written an official will to clearly determine who would inherit his estate. According to Massachusetts inheritance law at the time, if Andrew had died first and his wife Abby had survived him, then all of his assets would have gone to her. Upon her death, the estate would have been distributed according to general law, meaning Lizzie and her sister Emma might have received only a small portion unless Abby had written a will naming them as beneficiaries. In other words, if Abby had lived even just a few minutes longer than Andrew, the majority of the Borden fortune could have ended up in the hands of a woman the daughters deeply resented. But the reverse happened. Autopsy findings showed that Abby was killed 60 to 90 minutes before Andrew. This meant that legally she did not outlive her husband. As a result, her death had no impact on the line of inheritance. When Andrew died, his estate, valued at around $300,000 at the time, equivalent to over $8 million today, automatically passed to his two daughters, Lizzie and Emma, as his next of kin. Furthermore, tensions had already been brewing over property disputes. Andrew had previously transferred ownership of a house that once belonged to Lizzie and Emma's biological mother into Abby's name. The sisters were furious. In protest, they later bought the property back for a symbolic price of $1, a clear expression of disdain and defiance. In a household where father-daughter bonds had grown cold, the stepmother was shunned, and financial disputes had been smoldering for years. The motive of money was impossible to ignore. As one saying goes, nothing kills faster than greed. And in Lizzie's case, if she truly was the killer, the cost of becoming a millionaire may have been paid in blood, a whole lot of blood. A historic trial. On December 2nd, 1892, Lizzie Borden was officially indicted for first-degree murder, accused of killing her father and stepmother with an axe. The case immediately captured national attention. A young woman from a respectable upper-class family being suspected of butchering her own kin. It was something the public could scarcely comprehend. The trial began on June 5th, 1893, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and lasted for 14 consecutive days. The court had relocated the proceedings from Fall River, where the Borden family lived, due to concerns that local public opinion might compromise the fairness of the trial. Every day, hundreds of curious onlookers gathered outside the courthouse. Local and national newspapers sent journalists to report every detail, hour by hour. It was said that every facial expression, every tearful glance, every raised eyebrow from Lizzie was recorded, analyzed, and debated, as though she were a tragic heroine in a bloody drama. Throughout the trial, Lizzie remained silent. She did not testify in her own defense and made no public statements. However, her legal team, led by former Massachusetts Governor George D. Shettinson, mounted a highly strategic and effective defense. Robinson emphasized that there was no direct physical evidence tying Lizzie to the crime. No one had seen her commit the murders. There was no blood on her clothing, no eyewitnesses to any suspicious behavior, and no one had seen her wash up or dispose of a weapon. Even the axe found in the basement, thought to be the murder weapon, had no traces of blood, and forensic science at the time lacked the means to detect DNA or advanced residue. He also disputed the significance of the burned dress. According to testimony from the maid and neighbors, the dress had been stained with paint. and burning soiled garments was a common practice in households of that era. The defense argued that police and the public had rushed to interpret Lizzie's every action as evidence of guilt. One of the pivotal moments of the trial came when a witness testified that they had seen Lizzie in the barn behind the house, far from the murder scene, around the time her father was killed. If true, this would serve as a strong alibi, suggesting she could not have murdered Andrew Borden without leaving some trace behind. Prosecutors, on the other hand, insisted Lizzie had enough time to change her clothes, hide the axe, and stage her discovery of the bodies. They pointed to her strained family relationships, potential inheritance motives, and even her attempt to purchase poison days before the murders. But lacking hard evidence, their case remained largely circumstantial. After nearly 2 weeks of intense courtroom drama, on June 19, 1993, the jury returned its verdict, not guilty. Lizzie Borden was immediately released. Upon hearing the verdict, she broke down in tears. Some in the courtroom applauded, while others sighed in disbelief. Across America, public opinion remained fiercely divided. Some believed Lizzie was a wrongfully accused woman, while others were convinced that justice had failed and a cold-blooded killer had walked free. Though legally acquitted, Lizzie Borden could never escape the suspicion that followed her. She walked out of the courthouse a free woman, but no longer an anonymous one. From that moment on, the name Lizzie Borden was etched into American history as the center of one of its most controversial and captivating murder trials, one that continues to haunt the public imagination more than a century later. The verdict and aftermath. On June 19, 1893, after 14 intense and dramatic days of trial, the jury took just over an hour to deliver their final verdict. Lizzie Borden was not guilty. As the court clerk read the decision aloud, the entire courtroom held its breath. Lizzie, who had faced the terrifying prospect of execution by hanging, was acquitted. She wept, head bowed, while the crowd outside erupted with a storm of mixed emotions. Outside the courthouse, cheers rang out. Some applauded, and others even celebrated the verdict as a victory for justice. But not everyone was pleased. Across newspapers and cafes, and at dinner tables throughout America, debates raged on. Was Lizzie a cold-blooded killer or merely an innocent woman swept up in a tide of suspicion and gender bias? A significant portion of the public, especially women, rallied behind Lizzie. They believed she'd been treated unfairly simply because she was a woman. Many argued that if the suspect had been a man, the accusations might not have been so intense, and actions like burning a dress or changing one's story would have been seen as normal responses to trauma and panic. Yet many others, including members of law enforcement, remained convinced that Lizzie had murdered her father and stepmother. They believed she was clever and calm enough to cover her tracks, destroy the evidence, and fool everyone. But regardless of belief, the fact remained. Lizzie was never convicted. Following her release, Lizzie and her sister Emma inherited their father's considerable estate, estimated at around $300,000 at the time, equivalent to over $8 million today. With their newfound wealth, the sisters left behind the house where the tragedy occurred and moved to a large modern mansion in Fall River's affluent neighborhood known as The Hill. Lizzie named the new residence Maplecroft, as if to mark the beginning of a new life and escape from her bloody past. But the past would never let her go. Though the law declared her innocent, society never did. Most of her old friends abandoned her, neighbors kept their distance. Whenever Lizzie appeared in public, whispers followed her. Children sang a cruel rhyme. Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks when she saw what she had done. She gave her father 41. Ban. Though factually inaccurate, the rhyme became a dark emblem permanently attached to her name. In the years that followed, Lizzie changed her name to Lizbeth and lived a reclusive life at Maplecroft. Her relationship with Emma gradually deteriorated. In 1905, Emma abruptly moved out and never returned, refusing to explain why. Some said it was over money. Others believed Emma had discovered the truth and could no longer live with someone she suspected of being a murderer. Lizzie lived out the rest of her life quietly in her mansion until she died in 1912 at the age of 66. Her funeral was a somber, modest affair with very few in attendance. No family, no reconciliation, and no redemption. Only a few lines in the local obituary marked her passing. By then, few cared to remember whether she was truly guilty or not. Lizzie's death did not close the case. It simply ensured that its questions would remain unanswered forever. From that point on, she was no longer just a person, but a legend, the central figure in one of the most mysterious and controversial cases in the history of American justice. Bans. Theories without end. More than 130 years have passed since that bloody morning at 92 2nd Street in Fall River. Lizzie Borden was acquitted. Her father and stepmother were buried. Every witness has long since passed away, yet the case still holds an unshakable grip on the American psyche, an unsolved mystery that continues to haunt the imagination. The biggest question remains, who really wielded the axe? And if it wasn't Lizzie, then who? One of the most well-known alternative theories points to the maid, Bridget Sullivan. On the day of the murders, Bridget had been ordered to wash the windows in the sweltering heat, despite clearly being exhausted. She had also recently been scolded by Abby, and some believe she may have snapped in a moment of rage, first killing Abby, then Andrew to cover her tracks. What's more, although she was in the house during the time of the murders, Bridget claimed she heard nothing. Was that just bad luck? Or a carefully calculated lie? Others have suspected Emma Borden, Lizzie's older sister, who was said to be visiting friends in Fairhaven when the murders occurred. One theory suggests Emma may have secretly returned home, committed the murders, and then quietly left again to maintain her alibi. Supporters of this idea point to long-standing disputes between the sisters over inheritance. Emma was known for her calm and reserved demeanor, traits that could have helped her plan the perfect crime. After the trial, Emma suddenly cut all ties with Lizzie, never explaining why. Some believe Lizzie took the blame to protect her sister, while Emma lived the rest of her life in guilt and silence. A lesser-known but still compelling theory involves William Borden, believed to be Andrew's illegitimate son from an earlier relationship. Andrew never formally acknowledged William and excluded him from any inheritance. Proponents of this theory believe William may have come to the house that morning to demand financial support. A confrontation could have escalated, leading to the murders. Lizzie and Emma, if they discovered what happened, might have chosen to cover it up to protect the family's reputation. Each theory seems plausible in its own way, but crucially, none of the central figures, Lizzie, Emma, Bridget, or any other close relatives, ever spoke openly about the case after the trial. Lizzie never gave an interview, never wrote a memoir, and never defended herself publicly. Emma, who likely knew every corner of the family's history, remained completely silent until her death in 1920. Bridget left Massachusetts after the trial and lived the rest of her life in obscurity, never discussing what she might have seen or known. This enduring silence from the only people who might have known the truth has deepened the mystery over time. For over a century, historians, novelists, filmmakers, and amateur sleuths have continued to investigate the Borden murders, reconstructing the crime scene, digging into court transcripts, and proposing new evidence. Yet no single theory has ever convinced the public entirely. Each has its flaws. Every suspect has a reason to be doubted and a reason to be defended. Perhaps it is exactly this ambiguity, the lack of closure, that has elevated the Lizzie Borden case from a grisly family tragedy to one of the most iconic crime legends in American history. A case that chills not just because of the violence, but because of the haunting question that remains. Will we ever truly know the truth? Lizzie Borden, a cold-blooded killer, or an innocent woman caught in a family tragedy and judged by the harsh gaze of a biased society. More than 130 years later, the question still has no clear answer. There is no definitive evidence, no confession, and no one else ever came forward to take the blame. All that remains are fragmented pieces of a case that is as complex as it is mysterious. Perhaps we will never truly know the truth, but one thing is undeniable: the case of Lizzie Borden has become one of the most iconic and enduring crime stories in American history, where truth, justice, and doubt are forever intertwined. What do you think? Was Lizzie innocent, or did she cleverly escape justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Hit like if you found this story thought-provoking, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more gripping true crime stories like this one.